Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Talk Nerdy to Me podcast. I'm your host, Justin. With me today is my friend, Ken. We're going to be talking a little bit about something that both him and I are very passionate about, and that will be Dungeons and Dragons.
DND.
On this episode of the Talk Nerdy to Me. So a little history about Dungeons and Dragons. So in 1967, Gary Gygax created the International Federation of Wargaming, the IFW, providing a venue for wargame fans to exchange ideas and amateur game designs. Later, Gary would go on to create one of the largest board game conventions called Gen Con, hosted by Gygax at Lake Geneva Wargames Convention in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, now being held each year in Indianapolis, Indiana. As a second iteration of Gen Con, Gary Gygax would meet his co-creator of D&D, of Dave Arneson. I think I said that his name right. Arneson of Dungeons and Dragons, or D&D, is a tabletop role-playing game created by and credited creators of Gary Gygax and Dave Anderson in 1974, consisting of 3 booklets titled Men and Magic, Monsters and Treasure, and Underworld and Wilderness Adventures. In their first year, they had already sold out of their original 1,000 original copies, and the game has thus begun their story before TSR would sell their series and the rights to Gen Con to the Wizards of the Coast in June of 1997. Dungeons and Dragons has evolved over time. These evolutions serve as additions, going from 1st to 5th, and several edits along the way, with the next version being released in 2024, making the 50th anniversary of Dungeons & Dragons. This new edition is called OneDND, referring to 6th edition. And on that note, we are going to start our interview.
All right.
So, the first question I always ask is just kind of, so what was your, when did you first get into D&D? And what was your experience like for you?
So starting off then, D&D had always been something as somebody who grew up being nerdy and talking nerdy to people. Had always been in the background of my mind, especially when I started playing a lot of larger RPGs. Like, let's name even going back, like when I first started playing Elder Scrolls, playing through a lot of the Bethesda RPGs. I knew of dice rolling systems, the background, and learned that, okay, a lot of this is based on D&D and a lot of these kind of war games. So finally in high school, say about like 2009 or 10, my friend got a 1st edition book and was like, let's try this out, man. And lo and behold, we had no idea what we're doing. THAC0 scores meant nothing to us. We were like, I don't know what negative AC means. So we just kind of dilled around and really just kind of did a RP adventure where we built our own mini dungeon and just kind of started iterating, building, and playing until we got comfortable. And we loved it. It was just an idea to not only express characters we've always had in games, so again, playing those RPGs to life, but doing it in a collaborative environment. So it was really just my friend, my brother, and another buddy of mine. And we'd play, we probably did it 4 times, but that's how it started.
Yeah, I agree. So it's ironic enough, actually, my D&D experience also started in 2009. So for those at home, yes, but not together, obviously, because we grew up in different parts. I started my adventure in Arizona in high school. It was my freshman year. I just moved to the States. And I started hanging out with this group of people, and they're like, hey, man, you want to come play D&D with us? It was like, we haven't really played before. One of my buddies, his dad had really gotten him into D&D, and so we were looking at playing 3rd edition. And with, 3.5. And so when we were playing, he's like, yeah, man, you guys can just make characters, do whatever. And at first, the first session, I think I showed up and I was like, I don't know how I feel about this. Like, at this point, D&D didn't have the credentials that it has now where, like, playing it is cool.
Yeah.
I was like, I'm already kind of a nerdy guy. Like, I watch anime, like, I play video games. But at the same time, I'm like, I also one day might want to get laid. And I didn't really think that there was, like, an option to do both. And so I was like, I don't know. And then after session 1, I think I fell in love with the game. Because the story elements of the game are really what changed the mechanical factors for me. Like, I think as a player, I have a great time. I love being a player. Mm-hmm. But watching my DM describe these worlds for me and be able to just literally live within the worlds they're creating as a writer, especially from like a young age, I was like, that's what I want to do. That's who I want to be. And so for the next decade, I pretty much have consistently been a dungeon master, writing stories and allowing my friends to live in these worlds that I create. So I think it's a great experience. So what do you think draws people towards these games?
So it's a great question. Similar to you, that I think is kind of funny, is your and I D&D adventures mirror each other. We even had a conversation before this. The first game I ever GM'd was a Pirates game. So that was Pirates of the Spanish Main, a subsect of Savage Worlds. So if people aren't familiar, Savage Worlds is one of the most attainable tabletop systems, not based on D&D, but is a dice-based system that all goes off of dice types. And the more you upgrade, whether it's your strength, intelligence, wisdom, that goes up from a D4 to D6 to D8, so on. So you get better and better ways of improving skills. They explode with dice. If you're familiar with exploding dice, if you crit, you just keep rolling until you stop. very fun, but that's more story-based. It's a lot less in the weeds when it comes to math and a lot of the rules. It's really just have fun and get out there. And I think that is really the core for D&D for me, is what brings people in is, well, hello there.
So for those at home, on the table is Salem the cat, the love of my life, and co-star to me for every experience I do, because one, she lives here, and two, because she loves the camera. So I apologize. Can you continue?
Hey, we're close friends, so very nice to see you again. But really, I think that's what distills it down for me. For people, is it is an interactive storytelling experience unlike anything people have really played before. Because I always look at mediums and kind of drill down an interaction level. People love books because you get to look inside someone's head and live alongside them. But your interaction level is viewing. When it comes to games, you get to be, especially if it's an RPG where you get to create your character, like let's go to Daggerfall, you get to actually be your character and be part of an adventure like a GM, but the GM is the GPU. But even then, you can only really work within its parameters. But if you go even deeper than that, D&D means you get to not only interact with the world, create your character, but you can also influence it in a big way that other parameters that would be in a system would stop. Let's say if it's a game, you can only go so far unless you mod it. This world, if your GM especially is far more open-minded, you get to shape it, and there's something special about that.
Yeah, I agree. I think my favorite sort of avenue of why I think people are drawn to it, especially as a storyteller aspect, is I get to leave surprised. Mm-hmm. I think as a DM or even as a new game master, I think a lot of people show up to these games and they're thinking, oh, I'm making the world, I'm in control. But the reality is it's the opposite. My players are the ones who control the game. I think about it as if we're driving a car. I am both the gas and the stop. I'm the gas and the brake. But the players are the ones driving. They're like three goblins in a trench coat stacked up together as they kind of navigate the steering wheel and directional features of the game. And I kind of just have to accept I can speed up the performance of how fast the interactions will be, or slow down to a pacing to wherever they want to be. But ultimately, I'm not in control. And I think as someone who likes to describe the world and to tell stories, that is what makes this a unique platform. Because if I want to be someone who controls every aspect, I'll just write a book.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's you hit something I really like. The way I tell people when they ask what it is to be a GM, or how do I start being a dungeon master? I always tell people, I've got a few rules. We may go in later on to that, so I don't need to dive into it now. But the core of it is, I am building the framework. I build the skeleton, you flesh it out. And that's kind of what I tell people. I merely have the framework. You're the one that's pouring in the bronze and building this beautiful statue. So it's your story. I'm just helping tell it.
Absolutely. So, how has the game evolved since your initial experience to playing it, especially since you said you started off with first edition?
Oh yeah, it's so obviously at that point, 3.5 have been out since 2000. My first edition, my friends and I wanted to start fresh. We started off as hardcore as it gets, back when D&D was me versus you, GM versus player. So it was very antagonistic in terms of us okay, how do I outsmart my friend, a human player that's trying to play intelligence levels of these creatures? It was fun. It was a strategy game at that point. So we're actually playing a war game. But after going to 4th edition next, so that was actually one that my friends, when I joined in an official group, their dad had been playing since the 70s. I believe he'd met Gygax. Either way, from the beginning, really. So he'd been playing for a long time. Said, hey, I want to give you guys an experience. Ken, me, he's like, you haven't really played a full game yet, only a few first edition things, let's do this. So I started with 4th, which I know is very, a lot of people aren't the biggest fans of 4th or have issues with it. Soft spot, 'cause it was my first. I know its issues. I mean, maybe another podcast, I can dive into it. But the biggest changes was, after I went from 4th, I went to 3.5 and never looked back. So 3.5 is still my favorite because it is the most bloated in terms of numbers and choice, but that's what I love. The versatility of 3.5, they really leaned into it to save the system and save D&D as a whole, and it worked. So it changed in the respect that
you can put her on the ground.
Oh no, it's fine. We're having a good time. But I think to answer your question, the way it changed for me was I never did a linear way of jumping. I went all around, and I learned everything I loved from every system and was able to fold that into my GM style. So I learned that D&D always has something to give you, even if for 4th edition, for instance, you don't love everything. It had some really, really kick-ass stuff with Epic Destinies I think are really cool, and especially playing a 20 to 30 campaign, which most systems aren't built for, did it phenomenally. So that's the way I thought, if I want to continue this, I'll model it off the 4th system. So I kind of just took that in and built up this avatar, if you will, of D&D knowledge.
Yeah, I agree. I think for me, I started off with 3.5, which was heavily rule-based, like you were saying.
Oh, yeah.
And then I obviously started DMing at 5th edition because I realized very quickly that for newer players, 5th edition was the ideal opportunity because
easily, yeah.
It took all the math out of it. I'm not a math guy, as everyone who has ever watched any of my DM shows. I'm not the math guy. I'm a comms major for a reason. I accept my fate. But I do think that the storytelling elements were the most important. So very similar to like what you were saying before, my first campaign, which is another irony for both of us, was a pirate campaign.
It's so funny how that mirrors each other.
Yeah, it really is. And so I started off with an evil campaign. My players decided that they wanted to really sort of fall into their role as being this sort of evil pirate group. It eventually ended with a TPK because,
Oh, dang.
as many situations, I think the hardest thing that I always recommend, which kind of bleeds into our next question, is how to avoid metagaming.
Oh, yeah.
I think that that's one of the hardest aspects of being a player or a DM is how do you avoid the metagame, especially when you're in the room and someone's getting key details that maybe you aren't experienced to. So what is a way that you do that, maybe as a player or as a GM?
Yeah, that is honestly one of the other toughest questions my friends approach. Like, hey, I'm learning how to GM. How do I keep this balance with players who may be more inexperienced, don't know what to do with that? So I took a model after my friend's dad, the one I just mentioned, who started really, he's the one I told him I wanted to be a GM, and he like gave me the training course because he's like, I've been stuck doing this for 20 years. I want to be a player again. So he was like training me to be the next GM. Never got to, unfortunately, they moved. But the way he would do it was the classic of writing the note and sliding across the table. And that does two things. So I've augmented that a bit, but it was one, because the players look like, what's going on here? So it causes intrigue, but only that player knows the answer, and they can nod and kind of write something back to the GM. And that's fun, because a lot of people, again, say like, oh, there's something interesting going on. If they don't know that, you can also talk to the GM that way, just to cause a little bit of fun and make sure that people can still keep a narrative going on. If it's a god reaching out to your character in their head, internal monologue, whatever. I've taken that further with just doing Discord messages. So I usually do that privately. If it's something very plot relevant that only they should know, or someone asks them a question from their backstory and they want to verify it, I'll usually send it that way. So people will see that the note slip, if you will, and they pull out the phone, look over and type it. So they're like, okay, this is story relevant. And that means like character-wise, I want that to drive them to say like, hey, I'm willing to ask a question to further find out what's happening, but they won't know directly what to go into, so they don't metagame. And alongside that too, I also talk to my players and say that to the best of your ability, sometimes I'll just talk open at the table and say, hey, you would know this, or this is happening. And my players have played long enough now, they know to distance themselves from player versus character. But that takes time. So in the beginning, again, it was messages. Now a lot looser because people have that, but that's a skill you learn. That's hard otherwise.
Yeah, I agree. I think that that's really one of the things I try to focus on, especially on my shows, is like, obviously the players that I have they're all really good friends, especially like the Monster Manual campaign, which for those of you who don't know, the Monster Manual campaign is a Pokemon-inspired D&D campaign, focusing on the monsters from the Monster Manual, thus the name. It inspires a lot of fun and creativity because all the players, we started their starting point as they're already friends, and that kind of establishes like whatever information I give you isn't exclusive to your character, but rather a universal knowledge that everyone should experience and be a part of.
Absolutely.
And that's kind of how I devised for their group versus where my War of the Vanguard campaign, with them being 3 different unique characters, while the audience is given the opportunity to see into these sort of story points, given that I'm saying it to the entire group, I do think that it is one of the harder things. It's like, well, maybe those characters didn't want to showcase those notes to their cohorts yet, and it's kind of like you have to accept like where is and where isn't the boundaries, especially when you're doing these types of shows. For those at home, that's something that you should really think about if you're going to plan on doing one of these D&D type of shows, as they are really popular now on Twitch. Thinking about finding players who kind of can accept those roles of whatever I hear at the table does not mean necessarily my character right now. The biggest difference is who's my character and what is my player. Now, I think the biggest difference between that is a lot of times we as players think, well, I have all this information, but the opposite is actually more true. As a player, their character actually has more information than you know. For example, you might not be an expert in firearms, but your character can be, thus giving you this sort of illusion where, hey man, I don't know what type of gun that is, but my character should. Is that something I really need to roll for? And as a DM, you have to know, well, would their character need to roll for this? And kind of like express those sort of variables.
Yeah, and that's one of the things too I think is so important when they do a knowledge roll and they may already know this. That's why I may send them a message saying you'd already have this context, so the character or the player then can speak to their own expertise. Because that's one of the hardest things that many players talk about. So playing a high-int characters can be so difficult because you're like, hey, I have all this like educational planes or whatever knowledge, but me as a player, I don't. My character does. How do I reflect that? And I say, hey, this page of the book, I just slide to them like, this is what you know. And they can be like, oh, let me pick points off this. So it helps them feel more as their character, and of course in RPing, more immersed. So that's something I love. And I'm glad actually you have a camera here because I can show you part 2 of the what we did back in Wargamers. So the big thing I did back in college where I GM'd, it was a student group. So we all just played D&D. We would do, if we ever did out of character, so everyone would pause, no, this is just out of character, we do this, and everyone would see like that symbol, like, okay, cool, he's like out of character question or out of character comment, and then we went like back to RP. So anything said like this was in character, this to a player.
I absolutely love that. That's so great. Like just having those keynotes within your games, so that way everyone can understand, especially like your GM, where you might be asking something, they're like, are you asking this in character? Especially if people aren't using accents, because I think that's like, again, it's one of those things where it's great to have, but not everyone's Critical Role. We can't expect everyone to be a voice actor.
Yeah.
I mean, don't get me wrong, they're phenomenal. I absolutely love their show, but I do have to agree that like keeping those consistencies is very difficult for long-term shows. So looking into like the next question, what are you looking forward to in the next edition of the game?
Great question. So I've already seen the first few things they've released for one, like little tidbits. So for one, I hope that they were just joking around when they said auto 20 success on skills. I think that's silly. So I'm assuming that that seemed like almost an attention grabber. And if not, everyone in the comments I agree with, it's like, well, I'm just going to GM rule that we're going to do the original rules. That's not going to change anything. But the other big thing was there's a lot of 5th edition. So what 4th was for most people, 5th was for me. Yep. It took away being a 3-5 player and a 4 player. A lot of things I thought were innately baked in the game. So I'm really hoping we separate feats and leveling again. So we have feat progression and level progression. I think that takes away player agency, especially if you're a fighter, because that's your biggest thing is your feats that then augment your abilities. So separation. And then the other thing is I will never to this day understand why charge is feat blocked. So I want that just to be a thing again, because I was like, why? It's a simple engagement for any character to get in combat when you want to save spell slots and still do damage but open yourself up to get hit. It's not overpowered. It's very simple. And the fact it's feet blocked still boggles me.
Absolutely. I think it's crazy. So like one of the things that I always homebrew into my stories, you'll probably see it on both of my shows, especially with the Monster Manual campaign, given that they're all fighters, all of them start off with feats. And so how I'm doing it is essentially for their class, specifically for their campaign, feats go to the players, the bonuses go to their monsters, because their monsters are the ones who have magical abilities and ability checks and are actually rolling and mostly utilizing their combat skills. And so that's where the separation is. I also believe in the idea of like, if you are already proficient in a skill because you've done it enough times, you no longer roll for that skill. So if you've cut wood enough times, you're like, I'm proficient at wood cutting now. You've rolled enough times to determine like you're good at it. Stop rolling for it. Just it becomes part of the background of the story where it's like, yeah, we've seen these people roll to slice through someone or do this specific skill of climbing X, Y, or Z. And I think that's really why starting off at level 1 is so important, because it develops those skills, not just for you as a player, but also for as your DM. You get to see what your players like to do consistently and build off of those key points. I think for me, I think the biggest thing that I'm looking forward to is, again, the feat factors. I really think that'll be really interesting. I'm also interested to see how OneDND will be. They said this is supposed to be like the last generation of D&D. There is no more additions.
Yeah.
So it's like, so what are they going to do? Are we just going to continue to build upon this sort of campus, or are we going to look at something a little bit more unique?
Yeah, because I know right now they're building that framework online to kind of combat Roll20 and stuff like that. So, which makes sense. They need their own online full 3D platform that are doing it. I could see this being like the 3.5, where they just do a half edition step up and just add a crazy number of modules into it, but I also see this as becoming the repository for D&D. So you can host any campaign with any rule sets from 1st all the way to 6th and everything in between. And bringing back legacy campaigns like Tube of Annihilation, going back to Tube of Horrors, you name it. So I can see this just being, if you will, the true multiverse of D&D, the sigil, except a system.
Exactly. So my last question is, how do you think OneDND will be better or worse than the previous editions?
So I think it'll be better for one, the online platforms will be very nice because we have a lot of different ways of playing D&D, not always through wizards, again, through like things like Roll20 and other systems. Like I use Roll20 online with my friends and even build maps on Roll20 in a screen we actually play with, like set in the table. So it makes it a lot easier to move minis around, have fun, edit stuff, but having full 3D minis we can augment without having to go to Hero Forge or even uploading our Hero Forge minis to this. Heck yeah, I think really I'm more excited for the actual software aspect of this. Gameplay wise, it depends. Like if it really does catch me with, again, fixing everything I outlined before and still making it as accessible as 5 was, because that's one thing I love about 5 when I beta tested it years ago, was that it's, I mean, like you said, no number bloat to worry about, so easy to plug into. I always tell people that start with 5. If you want to learn more, we'll roll back. So I'm hoping it's still accessible. And again, the online platform really is as robust as even more so than Roll20. because I'm trying to look for a new. I pay for monthly subscriptions to it. I would love to go to Wizards and use their more intensive builder if that's the case.
Absolutely. I think for those at home, one of the things that I use a lot, I'm sure you do as well, is on the D&D site, you actually can go in, you can do encounter levels and encounter changes.
Yeah.
So I use that all the time to be able to build my encounters. It's something you have to pay a little bit more for, but having that or extra character sheets if you're always looking to do more than one, because as a DM, you're always building NPCs and you want them to have unique character flavor, especially if you want to give them maybe some player flair or flavors. It's always something I'm looking for. So I think for me, what I'm looking for most from this game is something unique, but the same.
Yeah.
I think if they can give us what everyone sort of derived from 5th edition, the goodness of 5th edition, like you said, and give us some of those things that the earlier editions, like 3.5, like we've kind of discussed, or 4th edition, with those sort of modular effects, I really could see this game going into something phenomenal. And I think with the popularity that D&D has now,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I think that much like a lot of the other sort of meta commentary that we've seen within the world, like Magic or other products that Wizard produces, I could really see this punching forward into being the next big thing that people play for the next 50 or plus years. So
100%.
on that note, we're going to go ahead and close up this episode. We'll probably come back to this topic because obviously, again, we both love this topic. We'll see you guys next time here on the Talk Nerd to Me podcast. Again, I'm Justin. This is Ken. See you guys next time. Take care.